That despair is the sickness unto death. Despair is a sickness of the spirit, of the self, and so can have three forms: being unconscious in despair of having a self, inauthentic despair, not wanting in despair to be oneself, and wanting in despair to be oneself. The human being is spirit, but what is spirit? Spirit is the self. What is the self? The self is a relation which relates to itself, or that in the relation which is it's relating to itself. The self is not the relation, but the relations relating to itself. A human being is the synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, a synthesis. A synthesis is a relation between two terms. Looked at in this way, a human being is not yet a self. In the relation between two things, the relation is the third term in the form of a negative unity. And the two relate to the relation and in the relation to that relation. This is what is from the point of view of our soul for body. Hold on. This is what it is from the point of view of soul for soul and body to be in relation. If, on the other hand, the relation relates to itself, then this relation is the positive third, and this is the self. Such a relation, which relates to itself, a self, must either have established itself or been established by something else. If the relation which relates to itself has been established by something else, then of course the relation is the third term. But then the third term, is a relation which relates in turn to that which has established the whole relation. Such a derived, established relation is the human self, a relation which relates to itself, and in relating to itself, relates to something else. That is why there can be two forms of authentic despair. If the human self were self-established, there would only be a question of one form, not wanting to be itself, wanting to be rid of itself. There could be no question of wanting. It's pretty silly. Hold on. There could be no question of wanting in despair to be oneself. For this latter formula is the expression of the relation, the self's total dependence, the expression of the fact that the self cannot by itself arrive at or remain in equilibrium and rest, but only in relating to itself by relating to that which has established the whole relation. Indeed, so far from its being simply the case that this second form of despair, wanting in despair to be oneself, amounts to a special form on its own. All despair can, in the end, will all despair can in the end be resolved into or reduced to it. If a person in despair is, as he thinks, aware of his despair and doesn't refer to it mindlessly as something that happens to him, rather in the way someone suffering from vertigo talks through an internally caused delusion about a weight on his head, or its being as though something were pressing down on him, etc. Neither the weight nor the pressure being anything external but an inverted image of the internal, and once now on his own, all on his own, and with all his might to remove the despair, then he is still in despair, and through all his seeming effort only works himself all the more deeply into a deeper despair. The imbalance in despair is not a simple imbalance, but an imbalance in a relation that relates to itself and which is established by something else. So the lack of balance in that for itself relationship also reflects itself infinitely in the relation to the power which established it. This then is the formula which describes the state of the self when despair is completely eradicated. In relating to itself and in wanting to be itself, the self is grounded transparently in the power that established it. The possibility and actuality of despair. Is despair a merit or a defect? Purely dialectically, it is both. If one were to think of despair only in the abstract, without reference to some particular despairer, one would have to say it is an enormous merit. The possibility of this sickness is man's advantage over the beast, and it is an advantage which characterizes him quite otherwise than the upright posture, for it bespeaks the infinite erectness or loftiness of his being spirit. The possibility of this sickness is man's advantage over the beast, and to be aware of this sickness is the Christian's advantage over natural man. To be cured of this sickness is the Christian's blessedness. Consequently, it is an infinite merit to be able to despair, and yet not only is it the greatest misfortune and misery actually to be in despair, no, it is ruin. Generally, the relation between possibility and actuality is not like this. If the ability to be such and such is meritorious, then it is an even greater merit actually to be it. That is to say, in relation to being able, being is an ascent. In the case of despair, however, in relation to being able to be actually being is one of descent. As infinite as is possibility's merit, just so great is the descent. So what amounts to an ascent in the case of despair is not being in it. Yet this way of putting it is again ambiguous. Not being in despair is not the same as not being lame, blind, and so on. If not being in despair means neither more nor less than not being in despair, then it is precisely to be in despair. Not being in despair must mean the annihilated possibility of the ability to be in it. For it to be true that someone is not in despair, he must be annihilating that possibility every instant. Usually, the relation between possibility and actuality is not like this. For although the thinkers say that actuality is annihilated possibility, that is not entirely true. It is the fulfilled, the active possibility. Here, on the contrary, the actuality not being in despair, which is thus also a negation, is the possibility annihilated, rendered impotent. Usually, the relation of the actual to the possible is one of confirmation. Here, it is a denial. Despair is the imbalance in a relation of synthesis, in a relation which relates to itself, but the synthesis is not the imbalance. The synthesis is just the possibility, or the possibility of the imbalance lies in the synthesis. If the synthesis were itself the imbalance, there would be no despair. It would be something that lay in human nature itself. That is, it would not be despair. It would be something that happened to a person, something he suffered, like a sickness he succumbs to, or like death, which is the fate of everyone. No, despair lies in the person himself. But if he were not a synthesis, there would be no question of his despairing. Nor could he despair unless the synthesis were originally in the right relationship from the hand of God. Where then does despair come from? From the relation in which the synthesis relates to itself, from the fact that God, who made man this relation, as it were, lets go of it, that is, from the relations relating to itself. And in the fact that the relation is spirit, is the self, lies the accountability under which all despair is every moment. What it is, however much and however ingeniously the despairer, deceiving both himself and others, sneaks of his despairs as a misfortune, though through a confusion as in the aforementioned case of vertigo, with which despair, though different in kind, has much in common, vertigo being under the aspect of the soul what despair is under the aspect of spirit, and pregnant with analogies to despair. So when the imbalance, despair, occurs, does it continue as a matter of course? No, not as a matter of course. If it continues, that is due not to the imbalance, but to the relation which relates to itself. That is to say, every time the imbalance manifests itself, and every moment it exists, one must go back to the relation. Note how one talks of someone bringing a sickness upon himself through carelessness, say, so the sickness sets in, and from that moment it takes effect and is now something actual. And its origin becomes more and more past. It would be both cruel and inhuman to keep on saying, you, the patient, are this very moment bringing sickness upon yourself. That is perpetually to resolve the actuality of the sickness into its possibility. It is true that he brought the disease upon himself, but he did that only once. The perseverance of the sickness is a simple consequence of the fact that that is what he once did. Its progress is not to be referred every moment to him as its cause. He brought it upon himself. But one cannot say, he is bringing it upon himself. Not so with despair. Every actual moment of despair is to be referred back to its possibility. Every moment he despairs, he brings it upon himself. The time is constantly the present, nothing actual, past and done with, comes about at every moment of actual despair. The despairer bears with him all that has gone before as something present in the form of possibility. This is because despair is an ascent of spirit. It has to do with the eternal in a person, but the eternal is something he cannot be rid of, not in all eternity. He cannot rid himself of it once and for all. Nothing is more impossible. Every moment he doesn't have it, he must cast or be casting it off, but it returns. That is, every moment he despairs, he brings the despair upon himself. For despair is not the result of the imbalance, but of the relation which relates to itself. And the relation to himself is something a human being cannot be rid of, just as little as he can be rid of himself, which, for the matter, is one and the same thing, since the self is indeed the relation to oneself. Despair is the sickness unto death. We must none the less understand this concept, the sickness unto death, in a special sense. Ordinarily, it would mean a sickness the end and outcome of which is death. Thus, one would speak of the sickness unto death synonymously with a fatal illness. In this sense, despair cannot be called the sickness unto death, but in the Christian understanding, death is itself a passing into life. For that matter, in Christian terms, no earthly physical sickness is unto death. For death is no doubt the end of the sickness, but death is not the end. If, in the strictest sense, there is to be any question of a sickness unto death, it must be one where the end is death and where death is the end. And thinking that is precisely to despair. Yet despair is the sickness unto death in another and still more definite sense, for there is not the remotest possibility of dying of this sickness in the straightforward sense, or of this sickness ending in physical death. On the contrary, the torment of despair is precisely the inability to die. In this, it has much in common with the condition of the mortally ill person who is in the throes of death but cannot die. Thus, to be sick unto death is to be unable to die, yet not as though there were hope of life. No, hopelessness is that even the last hope, death, is gone. When death is the greatest danger, one hopes for life. But when one learns to know the even more horrifying danger, one hopes for death. When the danger is so great that death has become the hope, then despair is the hopelessness of not even being able to die. It is in this latter sense, then, that despair is the sickness unto death, this tormenting contradiction, this sickness in the self, eternally to die, and yet not to die. To die, death itself, for to die means that it is all over, while to die, death itself means to live to experience dying. And if one can live to experience this for a single moment, then one lives to experience it forever. If someone is to die of despair as one dies of an illness, then the eternal in him, the self, must be able to die in the same sense that the body dies of this illness. But this is impossible. Dying in despair transforms itself constantly into a living. The despairer cannot die, no more than the dagger can kill thoughts. Can despair consume the eternal, the self that is the source of despair, whose warmth dieth not, and whose fire is not quenched? Yet despair is exactly a consumption. Wow. Yet despair is exactly a consumption of the self, but an impotent. Yet despair is exactly a consumption of the self, but an impotent self-consumption not capable of doing what it wants. But what it wants is to consume itself, for it cannot do, and this impotence is a new form of self-consumption, but in which despair is once again incapable of doing what it wants, to consume itself. This is a heightening of despair, or the law. For the heightening of despair, this is the hot incitement, or the cold fire in despair. The incessantly inward gnawing deeper and deeper in impotent self-consumption, far from its being any comfort to the despair that the despair doesn't consume him. On the contrary, this comfort is just what torments him. This is the very thing that keeps the sore alive and life in the sore. For what he, not despaired, but despairs over is precisely this, that he cannot consume himself, cannot be rid of himself, cannot become nothing. This is the heightened formula for despair, the rising fever and the sickness of the self. Someone in despair despairs over something. So, for a moment, it seems, but only for a moment, that at the same instant the true despair shows itself, or despair in the true guise. In despairing over something, he was really despairing over himself, and he wants now to be rid of himself. Thus, when the power-crazed person whose motto is Caesar or nothing doesn't become Caesar, he despairs over that. But this indicates something else, that he cannot stand being himself precisely because he failed to become Caesar. So really he is in despair, not over not becoming Caesar, but over himself for not having become Caesar. This self, which had it become Caesar, would have been everything he desired, though in another sense, just as much in despair. This self is now what he can bear least of all. In a deeper sense, what he cannot bear is not that he did not become Caesar. What is unbearable is the self which did not become Caesar. Or better still, what he cannot bear is that he cannot be rid of himself. By becoming Caesar, he would have despairingly been rid of himself. But now he did not become Caesar and despairingly cannot be rid of himself. He is really in despair either way. For he does not have his self, he is not his self. By becoming Caesar, he would still not have become himself. He would have been rid of himself. And by not becoming Caesar, he despairs at not being able to be rid of himself. So it is superficial, and and I dare say, typical of those who never observed a person in despair, not even themselves. To remark of someone in despair as though it were the penalty of despair, he is eating himself up. For that is just what he despairs of doing. That is just what to torment he that is just what to his torment he cannot do. Since with despair a fire takes hold of something that cannot burn or cannot be burned up, the self. Consequently, to despair over something is still not really despair. It is the beginning, or it is when the physician says of a sickness that it hasn't yet declared itself. Next comes the declared despair, despairing over oneself. A young girl despairs of love. She despairs of losing the loved one because he died or became unfaithful. This despair is not declared. No, she despairs over herself, the self of hers which, if it had become his beloved, she would have been rid of or lost in the most blissful manner, this self. Since it is destined to be a self without him, is now an embarrassment. The self which should have been her, oh, I don't know that word, richesse, Richesse, though in another sense, just as much in despair, had become now that he is dead, a loathsome void or a despicable reminder of her betrayal. Hold on. That's a long sentence. Hold on. The self of hers, I'm going to read that whole sentence because it's super long. It's like a whole paragraph. This self of hers, which if it had become his beloved, she would have been rid of or lost in the most blissful manner, this self, since it is destined to be a self without him, is now an embarrassment. This self, which should have been a richesse, though in another sense just as much in despair, has become, now that he is dead, a lonesome void or a despicable reminder of her betrayal. Just try now, just try saying to such a girl, "You are eating yourself up," and you will hear her reply, "Oh no, the pain is just that I can't." To despair over oneself, in despair, to want to be rid of oneself is the formula for all despair. So that the second form of despair, wanting in despair to be oneself, can be traced back to the first. In despair, not wanting to be oneself, rather, as in the aforegoing, we resolve the form. In despair, not wanting to be oneself, and to wanting to despair to be oneself, a person in despair wants despairingly to be himself. But surely, if he wants despairingly to be himself, he cannot want to be rid of himself. Yes, or so it seems. But a closer observation reveals the contradiction to be still the same. The self, which in his despair he wants to be, is a self he is not. Indeed, to want to be the self he truly is the very opposite of despair. To want to be the self he truly is the very opposite of despair. That is, he wants to tear his self away from the power which established it. But despite all his despair, this he is incapable of doing. Despite all his despairing efforts, that power is the stronger, and it compels him to be the self he does not want to be. But then this is still wanting to be rid of himself, rid of the self that he is in order to be the self he himself has chanced upon. To be self in the way he wants to be, that would be, even if in another sense, just as despairing. Everything he desired, but to be forced to be self in a way that he doesn't want to be, that is his torment, not being able to be rid of himself. Socrates proved the immortality of the soul from the fact that the sickness of the soul, sin, does not consume it as the body's sickness consumes the body. One can similarly prove the eternal in a man from the fact that despair cannot consume his self. That this is precisely the torment of contradiction in despair. If there were nothing eternal in a man, he would simply be unable to despair. But if despair were able to consume his self, then it couldn't really have been despair in the first place. Hmm. This then is this this then is the manner in which despair, the sickness in the self, is the sickness unto death. The despairer is mortally ill. It is, although in a sense quite different from any physical illness, the most vital parts that the sickness has attacked, and yet he cannot die. Death is not the end of the sickness, but death is incessantly the end. To be saved from the sickness by death is an impossibility, for the sickness and its torment and death are precisely to be unable to die. Inconceivable. Despair. Despair. The musical. That would be funny. Okay. One last paragraph. Okay. Jeez. That is the condition of despair. However much it eludes the despairer, however much, as must be especially the case with with the kind of despair which is ignorance of being in despair. The despairer has succeeded in altogether losing himself, and in such a way that the loss is not in the least way noticeable. Eternity will nevertheless make it evident that his condition is that of despair, and will nail him to his self, so that the torment will still be that he cannot be rid of himself, and it will be evident that his success was an illusion. And this eternity must do, because having a self, being a self, is the greatest, the infinite concession that has been made to man, but also eternity's claim on him. Well, that was the A section. I don't know if I'll read the B section. You know what? I think I could sneak it in because that goes from B to C. C is long. We could go to B. Fuck it. The alphabet industrial complex keeps winning. Just as a physician might say there isn't a single human being who enjoys perfect health. Am I recording still? Okay. Just as a physician might say there isn't a just as a physician might say there isn't a single human being who enjoys perfect health. So someone with a proper knowledge of man might say there is not a single human being who does not despair at least in a little, in whose innermost being there does not dwell an uneasiness, an unquiet, a discordance, an anxiety in the face of an unknown something, or something he doesn't even dare strike up acquaintance with, an anxiety about a possibility in life, or an anxiety about himself. So that, as a physician speaks of one's going about with an illness in the body, he goes about with the sickness, goes about weighed down with the sickness of the spirit, which only now and then reveals its presence within in glimpses, and with what is for him an inexplicable anxiety. And besides, there is no one, and has never been anyone outside of Christendom who isn't in despair, and no one in Christendom who is not a true Christian. And so far as he is not wholly that, and then he is still to some extent in despair. And besides, there is no one and has never been anyone outside of Christendom who isn't in despair, and in no one in Christendom who is not a true Christian. And so far as he is not wholly that, then he is still to some extent in despair. This observation will no doubt strike many as paradoxical and an exaggeration, and a gloomy and discouraging view besides. Yet it is none of these things. It is not gloomy. On the contrary, it tries to shed light on what one generally banishes to a certain obscurity. It is not discouraging, on the contrary, it is uplifting, since it views every man with regard to the highest demand that it can be made of him, to be spirit. Nor is it paradoxical. On the contrary, it is a consistently worked out basic view, and as far as that goes, no exaggeration. The common view of despair, however, goes no further than the appearances, and it is therefore a superficial view. That is, no view. It assumes that every man knows best himself whether or not he is in despair, so that whoever says he is in despair is assumed to be so, but also whoever thinks he is not is assumed not to be. As a result, despair becomes a rather rare phenomenon instead of being quite common. What is rare is not that someone should be in despair. No, what is rare, the great rarity, is that one should truly not be in despair. Am I despairing? But the common view has a very poor understanding of despair. Among other things, it altogether overlooks, just to mention something which, properly grasped, brings thousands upon thousands and millions under the category of despair. It altogether overlooks that the very fact of not being in despair, of not being conscious of being in despair, is itself a form of despair. One finds in the common view's grasp of despair, in a far deeper sense, what one sometimes finds with its deceptions about whether a person is ill or not, in a far deeper sense, for the popular view has far less knowledge of what spirit is than of sickness and health. And without that, one cannot have knowledge of despair either. Commonly, a person is assumed to be healthy if he himself doesn't say that he is ill. Even more so if he says he is well. A physician, on the other hand, looks on the illness differently. And why? Because the physician has a definite and articulate conception of what it is to be healthy and tests a person's condition against this. The physician knows that just as there are merely imagined illness, so too is there merely imagined health. For the latter, therefore, he first takes measures that will bring the illness to view. In general, the physician, just because he is a physician with knowledge and discernment, does not have unconditional faith in a person's own assertions about his state of health. If what every person said about his state of health, whether he is healthy or sick, where the trouble lies, etc., could be unconditionally trusted, then the role of the physician would be mere fantasy. For a physician's task is not just to prescribe medicines, but first and foremost to diagnose the sickness, and so again, first and foremost to determine whether the supposedly sick person is really ill, or whether the supposedly healthy person is perhaps in fact ill. Similarly, with the psychic expert's relation to despair, he knows what despair is. He is familiar with it, and so is not satisfied with the person's declaration either, that he is in despair or that he is not. For it must be pointed out that there is, in a sense, in which not even those who say they are in despair always are so. One can affect despair, and one can be mistaken and confuse despair, which is a characteristic of spirit, with all sorts of passing dejection or distraction, which go over without coming to the point of despair. But sure enough, the psychic expert regards these two as forms of despair. He sees quite clearly that it is affectation, but precisely that affectation is despair. He sees quite clearly that this depression, etc., is of no great significance, but precisely that fact that it neither has nor acquires any great significance is despair. Furthermore, the common view overlooks the fact that when compared with illness, despair differs dialectically from what one usually calls sickness, because it is a sickness of the spirit. And this dialectical aspect, properly understood, brings further thousands under the category of despair. If at any time a physician is convinced that so and so is in good health, and then later that person becomes ill, then the physician may well be right about his having been well at the times, but now being sick. Not so with despair. Once despair appears, what is apparent is that the person was in despair. In fact, it's never possible at any time to decide anything about a person who is not saved through having been in despair. For when whatever causes a person to despair occurs, it is immediately evident that he has been in despair his whole life. When someone gets a fever, on the other hand, it cannot possibly be said that now it is evident that he has had a fever all his life. But despair is a characteristic of the spirit, is related to the eternal, and therefore has something of the eternal in its dialectic. Not only does despair differ from an illness in having a different dialectic, but also in the fact that with regard to despair, every characteristic is dialectical, and so the superficial view so easily lets you down in deciding whether or not despair is present. Not to be in despair may mean precisely to be in despair, and it may mean having been saved from being in despair. A sense of security and repose may mean that one is in despair. That very scrutiny, that very peace, can be despair. It may also mean that one has got the better of despair and won peace. Not being in despair is not like not being ill, for, after all, not being ill cannot be ill, whereas not being in despair may exactly be to be in despair. It is not the case with despair as it is with illness, where the feeling of indisposition is the illness. By no means. Here again, the feeling of indisposition is dialectical. Never to have had a sense of this indisposition is precisely to be in despair. This means and stems from the fact that regarded as spirit, and if there is to be any question of despair, man has to be regarded under the aspect of spirit. The human condition is always critical. We speak of a crisis in connection with illness, but not health. And why not? Because physical health is an immediate characteristic which only becomes dialectical in the state of sickness. Where there is then talk of the crisis, with spirituality or when man is regarded as spirit, health and sickness are both critical. There is no immediate state of spiritual health. As soon as a man ceases to be regarded under the aspect of spirit, and unless he is regarded in that way, neither can there be any question of despair, but merely as a synthesis of soul and body. Then health becomes an immediate characteristic, and it is only in the soul's or the body's sickness that the dialectical arises. But despair is exactly man's own consciousness of being characterized as spirit. Even what, humanly speaking, is the most beautiful and loveliest thing of all, a womanly youthfulness which is sheer peace and harmony and joy, is nevertheless despair. For while it can be counted the greatest good fortune is not a specification of spirit, and deep inside, deep within good fortune's most hidden recesses, there dwells also the dread that is despair. It would be only too glad to be allowed to remain in there, for that is where despair has its most cherished, its choicest dwelling place, deep in the heart of happiness. All immediacy, in spite of its illusory security and peace, is dread, and quite consistently, therefore, it is most in dread of nothing. In immediacy, the most terrifying description of the most horrifying and definite something cannot inspire so much dread as a half-shrewd cannot inspire so much dread as a shrewd half-word, almost casually let slip, but surely and calculatingly aimed by reflection about something indeterminate. Yes, one inspires immediacy with the greatest dread of all by subtly letting it believe that it knows what one is talking about. For although immediacy surely doesn't know, reflection never traps its prey more surely than when it makes its snare out of nothing. And reflection is never more itself than when it is nothing. It requires an imminent reflection, or rather a great faith, to sustain a reflection on nothing, which is to say, an infinite reflection. So, even the most beautiful and lovely thing of all, a womanly youthfulness, is nevertheless despair. Is happiness, the greatest good fortune. One will scarcely have the good fortune to slip through life with this immediacy. And should this good fortune have the good fortune to slip through life, yes, it doesn't help much, but it is despair. For just because it is wholly dialectical, despair is not, despair is that sickness of which it is true, and it is the greatest bad fortune never to have had it. It is truly providential to get it, even though it is the most dangerous of all the sicknesses. One does not want to be cured of it. Usually, it is being cured of a sickness that we speak of in terms of good fortune. The sickness itself is the misfortune. It is therefore as far as possible from the truth that the common view is right, which assumes despair to be something rare. On the contrary, it is quite general. It is as far as possible from the truth that the common view is right, which assumes that anyone who doesn't think or feel he is in despair is not in despair, and that only the person who says he is in despair is so. On the contrary, he who says without pretense that he despairs is, after all, a little nearer, a dialectical step nearer being cured than all those who are not regarded, and who do not regard themselves as being in despair. But as a connoisseur of souls will no doubt concede, the normal situation is exactly this: that most people live without being properly conscious of being characterized as spirit, and to this one can trace all the so-called security, contentment with life, etc., which is exactly despair. People who, on the other hand, say they are in despair are, as a rule, either those who have so much more profound a nature that they are bound to become conscious of themselves as spirit, or those who have been helped by painful experience and difficult decisions to become conscious of themselves as spirit. Either one or the other, for very rare indeed is the one who in truth is not in despair. Ah, so much is spoken about human need and misery. I try to understand it, but even I try to understand it, have even been closely acquainted with not a little of it. So much is spoken about wasting one's life, but the only life wasted is the life of one who so lived it, deceived by life's pleasures or its sorrows, that he never became decisively, eternally conscious of himself as spirit, as self, or what is the same, he never became aware and gained in the deepest sense the impression that there is a God there and that he himself, his self, exists before this God, which infinite gain is never come by except through despair. Alas, also this misery that so many live their lives in this way, defrauded of the most blessed of all thoughts, this misery that one occupies oneself or in one's relation to the mass of mankind occupies them with everything else and uses them to provide the living energy for the play on life's stage, yet never reminds them of this blessedness, this misery that one heaps them together and defrauds them instead of separating them all from one another so that each individual may gain the highest, the only thing worth living for and enough to live in for an eternity. Methinks I could weep for an eternity for the fact that this misery exists. Ah, and here to my mind we have one expression more of the horror of this most dreadful of all sicknesses and misery, namely its hiddenness. Not just that someone suffering from it can wish to hide it such a way that no one at all, discovers it. No, but that it can be concealed in a person that he himself is not aware of it. Ah, and when the hourglass is run out, the hourglass of temporality, when the worldly tumult is silenced and the restless or unavailing urgency comes to an end, when all about you is still as it is in eternity. Whether you are man or woman, rich or poor, dependent or free, happy or unhappy, whether you bore in your elevation the splendor of the crown, or in humble obscurity only the toil and heat of the day, whether your name will be remembered for as long as the world lasts, and so will have been remembered as long as it lasted, or you are without a name and run namelessly with this numberless multitude, whether the glory that surrounded you surpassed all human description, or the severest and most ignominious human judgment was passed on you. Eternity asked you and every one of these millions of millions just one thing: whether you have lived in despair or not. Whether so in despair that you did not know that you were in despair, or in such a way that you bore this sickness concealed deep inside you as your gnawing secret, under your heart like the fruit of a sinful love, or in such a way a terrors to others you raged in despair. If you have lived in despair, then whatever else you won or lost, for you everything is lost. Eternity does not acknowledge you. It never knew you, or still more dreadful, it knows you as you are known. It manacles you to yourself in despair.